I had been standing at the trailhead for going on 3 hours when I understood that waiting was no longer something I could do. The parking area was a gravel pull-off on the north side of Route 612, 6 cars wide when the weather was good, and at that hour it held nothing but my truck and a rusted green sedan I assumed was Caleb's rental. The light had gone out of the sky around 5:30. It was 8:15. The temperature had dropped from the low 40s into the low 30s in the space of about 90 minutes, and there was a wind moving through the tops of the oaks along the ridge that I did not like the sound of. Huck was sitting on the passenger seat with his nose pressed to the gap at the top of the window, reading whatever the dark was sending down off the mountain, and he had not settled once in the past hour. That image is where I want to start, because everything that happened afterward comes out of that moment, and I have spent 2 years now trying to understand what I was actually standing at the edge of when I opened that truck door and clipped Huck's lead to his collar and put my headlamp on and started up the trail. I want to be honest about what I knew and what I didn't. I'm not a person who believes in things I can't explain. I want to be clear about that. I had spent 58 years building a careful, practical life on the foundation of what I could see and measure and account for. What happened on that trail in early November did not fit inside any of those categories. It still doesn't. I have stopped trying to make it fit. To understand why I was standing there, I need to go back about 3 years. Deb died on a Tuesday in late February, after 14 months of an illness that took her in stages. She was 54 years old. We had been married 31 years. I had known her since we were both in our mid-20s and working at the same trucking company outside Roanoke, her in dispatch and me in the shop keeping the engines alive. She had a gift for patience that I did not have and never acquired, and she had spent 3 decades deploying it on my behalf without complaint. When she died, I understood for the first time that patience is not just a quality a person has. It is something they extend to the people around them, and when it goes away, the people around them feel its absence in every room. I retired from diesel mechanics the following spring. 35 years in the trade, the last 12 running a small independent shop out of a converted barn on the back of our property in the foothills west of Charlottesville. I had figured, when I finally stopped working, that Deb and I would find things to do together. That was the plan we had talked about in an ordinary way for years, the same way people talk about plans they assume will arrive. Neither of us had gotten around to imagining the other possibility. After she was gone, I kept the shop out of habit more than purpose. I went out there each morning and did something with my hands. Rebuilt carburetors I didn't need to rebuild. Inventoried parts I already knew were there. The barn was easier to be in than the house, which had gotten very large and very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with its actual square footage. I stopped putting 2 coffee cups on the counter. That was harder than it should have been. There was a particular green mug of Deb's that I had moved to the back of the cabinet, because seeing it each morning was a thing I wasn't managing well. And then, about 6 months in, I moved it back out because not seeing it felt worse. It sat on the counter every morning from then on, empty. And that was what I did instead of grieving in any organized way. Caleb had come home for the funeral and stayed 2 weeks. And those 2 weeks were the last time we had spent any real time together. He was 33 by then, living in Asheville, working in land restoration and native plant management, which was work Deb had always understood better than I did, and which I had always listened to him describe without quite following the particulars. He looked like his mother around the eyes, and he had her same tolerance for sitting still, which I had never cultivated in either of them. After the funeral, after the paperwork and the neighbors and the casseroles and all of it, after Caleb drove back to Asheville and I was alone in the house for the first time, I realized I had no idea how to be his father without Deb in the room to translate us to each other. The calls got shorter, then less frequent. Less. Then one phone call in late spring of the following year went sideways over something I can no longer reconstruct precisely. Some misunderstanding about the property and what I intended to do with it. And we both said things that were more truthful than kind. After that, 14 months of a silence that I told myself was temporary, and then stopped telling myself anything at all. I had his number in my phone. I knew how to use a phone. There is nothing more to say about that particular failure except that it was mine, and I carried it. Early November, I was in the barn doing nothing useful when my phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from Caleb. It was the first message of any kind in 14 months, and I read it 3 times before I took it in completely. He said he was doing a solo overnight on the Ridgeback Trail up in the Blue Ridge foothills, 2 hours north. He said he knew it was late in the season. He said he had checked the forecast and packed appropriately. He said he was starting at the trailhead on Route 612 first thing in the morning and planned to be back to his car by 5 o'clock at the latest. And if I didn't hear from him by 6, I should call the ranger station. He said that Deb's birthday was the following day, and he needed to do something with that fact that he could do with his body. He said he was telling me because he didn't want me to find out some other way. He did not ask me to come. He was careful about that. I sat with the phone for a long time. I couldn't tell if the hike was grief, or if it was something directed at me, an act meant to prove something or claim something, and I spent about an hour going back and forth on it before I understood that I was doing what I always did, which was analyze a thing instead of move toward it. I almost didn't tell anyone I was considering going. Then I went next door. Marta Sills had been our neighbor for 20 years. A practical woman in her mid-60s who ran a small goat operation on the adjacent 8 acres, and who had brought food every other day for the first month after Deb died without once asking what I needed. She was mucking a stall when I came around to her barn, and I showed her the text without saying anything. She read it twice. She handed the phone back and went back to what she was doing. "Roy," she said, "you can stand here and explain to me all the reasons you shouldn't go, or you can go." I got home, loaded the truck, put Huck's bed behind the passenger seat, and drove 2 hours north in the dark. My plan, if it can be called that, was to wait at the parking area. I was not going to go up the trail and embarrass him. I was not going to arrive as a rescue. I was going to be there in case he needed something, and if he walked out at 5 o'clock with his pack on his back and a clean bill of health, I would tell him I'd been passing through, and we could decide from there what that meant. That was what I told myself. It was the kind of plan that made sense in the truck and made less and less sense as the hours accumulated and the temperature dropped and the sky went fully dark. At 8:15, Huck whined and pressed his nose so hard against the window gap that it fogged the glass. I took that as a kind of answer. The Ridgeback Trail runs 6 miles one way to a ridge summit that tops out around 3,000 feet. It's not a technical trail, but in early November with the leaves down and the temperature dropping, the rocks get slick in ways you don't expect, and the light goes fast on the north-facing sections. I had a headlamp and a handheld flashlight and a first aid kit from the truck, and my old canvas barn coat, which was not ideal, but was what I had. Huck had the lead clipped to his harness. We went in. The first mile was ordinary. The trail wound through a section of second-growth hardwood, mostly oak and hickory, with the occasional tulip poplar standing tall enough that my headlamp didn't reach the canopy. The leaf litter was deep and wet from rain 2 days earlier, which made the footing soft but quiet, and I could hear Huck's breathing and my own, and not much else. That was fine. It was a November night in the mountains. The absence of sound was appropriate. Somewhere around the second mile, it stopped being appropriate. There is a particular quality to the quiet of a wooded ridge when the animals have all decided to be somewhere else. I had spent enough time in the woods to know what ordinary November quiet sounds like, which is to say, it sounds like something. A mouse in the leaf litter, a barred owl working the hollow below the trail, the intermittent complaint of branches settling in the wind. What I walked into somewhere past the 2-mile marker was a different kind of quiet. It had a quality of held breath. It was the quiet of a space that had been emptied of its usual population, rather than the quiet of a space that was simply dark and cold. I stopped. I told myself it was the temperature. Animals go still when the cold comes down hard and fast. I told myself that. I walked another 1/4 mile and stopped again and listened. The same held quality in the air. Huck was walking at my heel without pulling, which he did not ordinarily do. He walked with his head low and his nose working, and he was not tense the way a dog gets tense when something has frightened him. He was attentive in a way I had not seen from him before, deliberate and calm, as if he had been asked to pay attention and had decided to comply. I told myself it was a deer, a large deer, maybe a buck still in rut, moving through the timber above the trail. That would account for the quiet. Other animals getting out of the way. I believed that explanation for about 3 minutes. Then I heard movement in the timber to my left, maybe 40 feet up the slope, and it was not a deer. The sound was too heavy and too measured. Whatever was moving up there was picking its path carefully, which is not how deer move when they're spooked, and not how they move when they're feeding. It moved the way something moves when it has a purpose and is in no hurry about it. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. I stood there with my headlamp pointed at the trail, and I was aware in a physical way that bypassed any reasoning I was doing that something very large had also stopped and was aware of me. I started walking again. If you've ever been in the woods at night with something you cannot categorize moving alongside you, you understand that the body has opinions about the situation that the mind cannot simply override. My body wanted to move quickly toward the truck. What I knew about my son being somewhere ahead of me on that trail was the thing that kept my feet pointed uphill. I kept walking. The movement in the timber resumed, paralleling the trail maybe 30 feet out, methodical and unhurried. Huck walked at my heel and did not growl and did not pull toward the trees. I found Caleb's pack about 1/2 mile from the ridge summit. It was sitting against the uphill side of a boulder just off the left edge of the trail, not thrown down in any panicked way, but set down with care, the way you'd set a pack down if you needed your hands free for something. His water bottle was still clipped to the exterior. One of his trekking poles was leaned against the same boulder. The other one was not there. I called his name. My voice went up the trail and came back to me without an answer, and then I called again and heard something move on the rocks above. He was sitting on a flat-topped granite outcropping about 40 yards further up the trail in the beam of his own headlamp, his right boot unlaced and his right leg stretched out in front of him. He looked up when he heard me coming, and his face did something complicated that I did not have the vocabulary to read at distance. "Dad," he said. That was all for a moment, just the word, with a quality in it that I had not heard from him in a very long time. I climbed up to the rock and crouched down and looked at his ankle without touching it yet. It was swollen through the sock, which told me enough. "Turned it on the descent," he said. "About an hour ago. I've been working on whether I could walk on it." "Can you?" "With the pole I can, but I only have one pole." I looked back down the trail toward his pack. "The other pole is against the rock with your pack." "It broke," he said. "I dropped it on a bad step and the ferrule snapped. I figured one was better than nothing, but I've been sitting here trying to figure out the math." I sat down on the rock next to him, and we stayed there for a moment, not talking. The wind had dropped. The woods were very still. I was aware, in a low-frequency way, that the thing moving in the timber had also gone still somewhere in the trees below us, and that its stillness had the same deliberate quality as its movement had earlier. "I got your text," I said. "I figured you'd stay home." "I did for a while." He looked at me for a moment and then looked away. "Mom would have come," he said. "Yeah," I said. "She would have been here about 4 hours ago." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and it was the first honest thing I had heard from either of us in a very long time. I told him to stay put while I went back down for his pack. It was 60 yards of trail in the dark, and I did it quickly, and when I came back up to the rock where he was sitting, I had the pack on my back and I was carrying the second trekking pole in my right hand. I had picked it up without looking at it closely. I set everything down on the rock next to Caleb and started working out how to rig a support system with what we had. That was when I looked at the pole. The ferrule at the bottom had broken clean through, the way those aluminum collar pieces sometimes do on rocky terrain. I had seen it a dozen times. A clean break, nothing to be done with it in the field. But the bottom section of the pole was not loose. It was wrapped tightly and evenly in a length of something I needed a moment to identify. It was inner bark, stripped fresh from what looked like tulip poplar. It was wrapped in a flat spiral, each pass overlapping the last, from just above the break to about 4 inches up the shaft, and it was bound off at both ends with what I can only describe as a tight tuck, the kind of finish that takes patience and a knowledge of how to use material that doesn't want to cooperate. The repair was not decorative. It was structural. It was the kind of fix that would let the pole bear weight for a short distance on easy terrain. I turned it over in my hands. I am a mechanic. I have spent my life assessing whether a repair will hold and what it was made of and who made it. This repair had been made by something with hands, something that understood what the pole was for and what it needed to do. I looked at Caleb. "Did you do this?" I asked. He shook his head. "Do what?" I handed it to him. He held it under his headlamp and looked at it for a long moment. "That wasn't like this when I dropped it," he said. We both sat there. I let him have time with it. Then I turned and looked down the trail toward the tree line where the timber fell away from the rocky summit slope. And that is when I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 50 feet below us on the slope. And at first my mind tried to give it to me as something else. A snag. A dark rock formation. My headlamp was pointed up the trail, so what I had was the ambient light from Caleb's lamp and from my own reflecting off the pale granite. And in that low and scattered light, what I saw was this. A figure standing upright, 8 feet tall at a conservative estimate, covered in dark fur that the cold air seemed to move through in a slow, continuous way. The shoulders were wide enough to be wrong. The arms were long. It was absolutely still, standing with a quality of presence that I have no better word for than deliberate. It was not lurking. It was not hiding. It had positioned itself where it could be seen. The eyes caught the light. I have been looking for the right way to describe what I felt in that moment for 2 years, and I have not found it. It was not fear. There was no threat in the posture, no movement toward us, no sound. What I felt was closer to the sensation of being recognized, the way it felt when Deb used to look up from whatever she was doing and see me come through the door after a long day, before any words happened. The quality of being visible to something that had been paying attention. Huck was sitting at my heel. He was not growling. His tail moved once, slow and low, and he let out a breath through his nose and stayed seated. I looked at the creature for what I think was about 30 seconds, which is a very long time when you're counting it. It looked back. Then it turned without any hurry and moved into the timber. The trees swallowed it in 3 steps, and the sound of its passage lasted maybe 5 seconds, a deep and even movement through the brush. Nothing crashing, nothing panicked, and then silence. The woods stayed the way they had been. The cold settled back in around us. I sat there holding the repaired trekking pole, and I thought about my son sitting on this rock in the dark for an hour, unable to walk, and about the thing that had found his broken pole somewhere on this slope and had done the only useful thing it could do with it and had put it back where he could find it. I didn't have words for it. I still don't. What I had instead was the specific sensation of something giving way inside my chest that had been locked there for 3 years, not breaking, giving way. The way a rusted bolt finally gives way when you have applied steady pressure long enough. It moved through me quietly in the cold, on that piece of granite, and I sat with it for a moment, while Huck breathed beside me, and Caleb waited for me to say something. I didn't tell Caleb what I had seen. That was a decision I made in the first few seconds, and I have not changed it since. What he had seen was the pole repair, and what he would make of that was his own. What I had seen in the tree line was mine. "You think this will hold?" he said, meaning the pole. I tested the bark wrapping with both thumbs, applying pressure from different angles. It did not shift. "For 6 miles on a good trail," I said. "With you going slow and leaning on it rather than jabbing it, yes, it'll hold." He nodded. He started pulling his boot back on, slowly, and I helped him lace it firm without too much pressure on the ankle itself, the way you do when you're trying to stabilize without cutting circulation. He grunted once and then had it. We put both packs on me and I gave him the repaired pole in his right hand for the downhill, and we started walking. The trail going down is easier in some ways and harder in others. Harder on a turned ankle because gravity is working against you on the good foot, and every step is a managed fall. We went slowly. He set the pole carefully on each step, and I stayed close enough that he could have grabbed my arm without asking. The timber was dark on both sides, and the headlamps put a clean tunnel of light down the trail in front of us, and we walked inside that tunnel for a long time without saying much. About a mile down, he said, "I'm sorry about the last 14 months. I kept walking for a few steps." "Yeah," I said. "Me too." I didn't know how to be. He stopped, started again. "After she died, I didn't know how to be around you." "I know," I said. "I didn't make it easy." "No," he said, and there was no accusation in it, just agreement, which was harder to receive than accusation would have been. We walked another 1/4 mile. The leaf litter was quieter going down, the frost working into it now, and our boots made a soft, crisp sound on each step. "She would have hated this whole situation," he said, "both of us being idiots in different directions." "She'd have been polite about it," I said. "She was good at polite." "For about a week," he said, "and then she would have said something." "Yeah," I said, "she would have." We came down off the rocky upper section onto the softer trail through the hardwoods, and the going got easier, and somewhere in there we stopped having a conversation and started just walking together, which was its own thing, different from the conversation, but not lesser. By the time the trailhead lights showed through the trees ahead, 2 hours and a bit after we had started down, his ankle was holding and the pole had held, and we were still talking in that quiet, careful way that people talk when they have gotten through something and are not yet ready to put it down. I drove him to an urgent care clinic 20 minutes south on Route 612. Nothing broken, a grade 2 sprain. They wrapped it and told him to stay off it, and he nodded with the particular expression of someone who does not intend to fully comply. We sat in the parking lot afterward with the engine running and the heat up and Huck stretched across the back seat. "I want to try again," Caleb said. "With us, whatever that looks like now." So do I said. He looked at me for a moment. Did something happen up there? You've got to look. I've been worried about you for 3 hours, I said. That's the look. He accepted that. I don't know whether he believed it. We drove to a diner outside town that was still open at 11 at night, the kind of place that has been making the same breakfast menu since before either of us was born. And we sat in a corner booth and ate eggs and drank coffee and talked for 2 hours in the unguarded way that exhaustion sometimes permits, the way that sleep deprivation strips the edge off the things you've been protecting. We talked about his mother. We talked about her last months and the things we had each carried from them separately, without ever comparing notes, the way two people can live through the same event in entirely different rooms. We talked about his work and about what I was doing with my time and about the property and what I actually wanted to do with it. None of it resolved into anything tidy. We were not trying for tidy. I dropped him at his rental car at the trailhead at 2 in the morning. The temperature was in the upper 20s, and the gravel was frosted, and our breath made clouds in the cold air. "I'll call you when I get home tomorrow," he said. "All right," I said. He got in the car and I watched the headlights move down Route 612 until the road bent away. Huck put his head on the center console and I let him stay there. I drove home with my hands on the wheel and the heat running and the radio off, watching the road unreal in the headlights, and I thought about the pole and the bark wrapping, and the eyes that had caught the light, and the way Huck's tail had moved once and then been still. I thought about the green mug on the counter, sitting there empty each morning for 3 years, as the best I had been able to do with a particular kind of loss. I got home at 4 in the morning. I did not sleep. I made coffee, enough for 2 cups, and I filled Deb's green mug and set it on the counter next to mine and stood in the kitchen in the dark and let the house be whatever size it needed to be. Caleb called the following evening, as promised. We talked for 40 minutes. It was not a smooth conversation. There were silences in it, and a few false starts, and at least one moment where we were both clearly thinking something we decided not to say. That is what a real conversation between two people who have been estranged sounds like, and I was grateful for every awkward second of it. We made a plan to talk again the following week. Then we did. That became the pattern. I've told this story twice before this telling. Once to Marta, standing in her barn about a month after it happened, and she listened without interrupting, and at the end she said, "You went up that trail for him, and you came back with something too." And then she went back to what she was doing. Once to myself, in the shop on a winter afternoon, out loud to no one, just to hear what it sounded like when I tried to put it into words. It sounded truer than I expected, and stranger than I had the framework to contain. I took the repaired trekking pole home in the truck. Caleb had not wanted to keep it. I understood that. I kept it in the shop for a few weeks and looked at the bark wrapping from different angles and thought about the hands that would have had to do that work, the patience of it, the knowledge of what inner bark will and won't do when you ask it to hold something together. Eventually, I put it on the shelf above my workbench, between a brake drum I was rebuilding and a jar of valve cover gaskets. It fits there. The bark has dried and tightened on the shaft. It is not going anywhere. I went back to the Ridgeback Trail once, in March, after the snow had come and gone and the tulip poplars were starting their first soft green. I didn't go looking for anything. I walked the 6 miles to the summit and stood there in the morning light and looked out over the folded ridges going south and thought about my son sitting on that granite in the dark and the thing that had come down the slope and done the only useful thing it could do and then stepped back into the trees. I was up there for an hour. I saw nothing unusual. I heard nothing that didn't belong. Whatever had been there in November was not there in March, or was there and not choosing to be seen. And I found I was at peace with not knowing which. On the way back down, passing the boulder where the pack had been left, I stopped and laid my hand on the rock for a moment. It was cold and solid and real under my palm, and that was all it was. And that was enough. I don't know what was on that trail. I have turned the question over 100 times, and I cannot get it to come out clean on any side. I know what I saw, and I know what I held in my hands, and I know what Huck did not do when any other dog would have done otherwise. I know what the bark wrapping meant for the feral, and I know what the feral meant for my son's ability to walk down 6 miles of mountain trail on a turned ankle in the dark. And I know what my son's ability to walk down that trail meant for the two of us sitting in a diner at 11 at night, talking about his mother in the specific and honest way we had never managed before. That is a chain of particulars, and I trust chains of particulars. I built my working life on them. Whether the thing that built that chain understood what it was building, I cannot say. I have thought about it, and I have no answer that satisfies me. What I can say is that whatever moved through those trees had been watching the trail long enough to understand that a broken tool was a problem, and that putting it right was something it was able to do. Beyond that, I keep my own counsel. Marta's goats got into my fence line the following spring, and I spent a Saturday afternoon restringing the lower pasture wire with her. And at some point while we were working, she said, without preamble, "How's Caleb?" "Good," I said. "He's talking about coming down for Christmas." She clipped the wire and didn't say anything. "First time in 4 years," I said. She nodded and we went back to work. She didn't make anything of it, and that was right. He came in December. He slept in the back bedroom, and we cooked a poor excuse for a turkey and watched the game and went for a walk in the cold on the back of the property, past the shop, through the lower pasture, and along the fence line and into the edge of the timber where the big hemlocks start. We didn't talk about the trail. We didn't need to. What the trail had done was separate from what we were doing in that particular walk, and the one had made the other possible, and that was sufficient. I went back to my coffee in the mornings after he left. 2 cups, my usual, and the green mug. I had figured out by then that making coffee for 2 was not a thing I was doing out of grief, so much as a thing I was doing out of gratitude, which is a different motion even when it looks the same from outside. There are mornings now when I carry both cups out to the porch step and sit there with Huck while the light comes up through the hemlocks, and I watch the tree line the way I watch anything I've learned to take seriously. I don't expect to see anything. I haven't seen anything since November. What I carry from that night is not an expectation. It's closer to a knowledge that the world is larger than my working model of it, and that something inside that larger world noticed a father and a son who had gotten very far apart and did the only practical, quiet thing it could do with what was available. The green mug sits on the counter every morning. Huck settles at the base of the porch step, nose to the cold air, reading whatever the timber is sending. Some mornings that is all there is, and it is enough.